off with thank you everyone for joining us this evening for our presentation on coastal resiliency with a focus on shoreline erosion. We're really excited to have two amazing professionals from the University of Michigan joining us to share their expertise. But we'll go over a little bit of housekeeping before we kick it off. We ask that everyone remains muted during the presentations, but please feel free to use the chat feature to drop any questions or comments or things like that. I'll be actively checking that and responding, and we will also have a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, we will get going.
Awesome. Thank you, Em. Let me just share my screen real quick and go to the right, go to the right slide. There we go. Okay.
All right. So this is the final installment of an ongoing series that we've been putting on over the last few months that is funded by a grant from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Indiana Dunes, or Indiana Department of Natural Resources, the Lake Michigan Coastal Program, which is really focused on coastal resiliency and the many topics that cover that, and really geared toward folks who live here and have the biggest impact to kind of get involved and advocate for a healthier coastal resiliency. So tonight's shoreline erosion topic is the final one. We have all of the previously recorded presentations available on our YouTube page. So if you haven't already gone over there, I will drop the link in the chat momentarily to link to our YouTube page so you can see those. Okay, a little bit of who we are at Save the Dunes. So Save the Dunes supports policies and actions that protect the Indiana Dunes, Lake Michigan, and the surrounding natural areas, and for the people who live, work, and recreate in Northwest Indiana. But we also love to have folks who have Northwest Indiana or Lake Michigan close to their heart, and to continue to learn and educate those folks. And Save the Dunes does work through conservation, advocacy, and community engagement. I am the community engagement coordinator for Save the Dunes. We also have Harshini here with us, who's our advocacy coordinator. So you've got the whole team here. Okay, and our two guest speakers that we're welcoming to the screen this evening are Guy Meadows, PhD. Here are their very impressive resumes listing underneath, and Richard K. Norton. So we will kind of split time tonight. We'll all take a little bit of time, so feel free to, like I said, leave questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get started from there.
Awesome. Thank you, Em. I will stop sharing screen now. And Guy, if you would like to share screen, feel free. Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, guys. And it's a pleasure to be here. And those of you that are on the webinar here, it's an honor to speak with you tonight. As we said, we'll try and keep our presentations as quick as possible so that there's plenty of time for questions. So I want to start out with the big picture. The Great Lakes are very new features, geologically speaking. They were created by the glaciers and exposed at the final retreat of the most recent glacier about 12,000 years ago. So that means that they are very new features geologically. They're very, very steep-sided and very deep. And the natural process for any body of water with those kinds of dimensions is that they get wider and shallower. And that widening of the Great Lakes is what we call coastal erosion. So it's an ongoing process. It's a process that is going to continue whether we would like that or not. For Lake Michigan in particular, which is what we'll focus on tonight, the background erosion, this erosion that occurs without any human intervention, is on the order of a foot a year. So the Michigan shoreline is getting a foot wider each year, as is the Wisconsin shoreline. And that results in shoreline erosion. And the arrows on the diagram on the right-hand side are the transport of sediment down a river of sand that essentially flows down both sides of Lake Michigan and accumulates offshore of the lucky state of Indiana. So it's over the last several thousand years, there has been a great increase in the amount of sand, nearshore sand that is accumulated off the Indiana shoreline. The major forces that are interacting here on the shoreline are wind, waves, and water levels. And we'll talk about each of these as quickly as we can. As the wind blows over the water surface, the wind creates waves. And obviously the stronger the wind is, the bigger the waves can become. But on the same token, if we have a gust of wind of 50 miles an hour, it certainly will make the water surface all agitated with whitecaps and stuff, but the resulting waves will not be very big. But the second factor is the duration that the wind blows. So if the wind blows for a long period of time, say 2 days, then the waves can grow extremely large. And finally, if there is a large open water area for the wind to do its work on the waves, then again, waves get larger. So in Indiana, if there's a north wind from blowing all the way down Lake Michigan, over a very large fetch distance for a very long time, waves in excess, as you well know, of 25 feet are common along your section of shoreline. Waves are primarily responsible for moving the sediment. The other currents that exist in Lake Michigan are not strong enough to move sediment. So it really is the wind waves that are moving this river of sand down the shoreline towards Indiana. So waves are the drivers of our coastal erosion. And the final force involved is where water levels are. And we call water levels the enabler. They don't in themselves move sand a whole lot, but they are the ones that enable shoreline erosion to occur. And it occurs as it changes the location where waves can do their work. During low water times, waves have a wide beach and several sandbars to dissipate their energy. But over high water times, waves can work directly at the base of the dune or bluff, and that causes major changes to the overall shoreline. Again, looking at the big picture, I know this is hard to see, but this is water levels. The upper panel is Lake Superior, and the second panel is Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, followed by St. Clair, Erie, and Ontario. On the far left, it starts at 1918 and runs on the right side to 2024. So this is 100+ years of records. We have water level records of the Great Lakes that go back to the Civil War, but this is the most accurate in the last 100+ years. And the point I wanted to make is these are water levels in the lakes are the results of colossal storm systems that move across the whole continent of North America. So over here in the mid to late 20s, you'll notice all the lakes are seeing low water. Well, those are the Dust Bowl years that you hear about from the Midwest and the Western prairies. Similarly, we had the high record was in 1986 of water levels here, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and on down. Everybody is seeing high water levels at the same time. What is really unique is something that has happened recently. Starting in 1999, we had this big drop in water levels here on Lake Michigan, and this low water time persisted for 14 years. So coming at 2013, water levels began to rise extremely fast and set a new all-time record in 2020. And I'm sure that's fresh in all of your recollections. We also set a new record low in 2013. So this rapid change from over 100 years of rising and falling water levels, of having a record-setting low and 7 years later a record-setting high is literally unheard of. And that's why one of the reasons we believe that the storms that are causing winds and waves and erosion are becoming more extreme. And we'll talk about that a bit more. So during this is a blow up of that period from the last high water level in 1986, another secondary high in 1997, not quite as high, but then in 1999, this 14-year period of extremely low water levels, which allowed the beaches to recover quite a bit from the high water devastation that happened in 1986. And we've learned a lot about the give and take that the wind and the waves and water levels play with the shoreline. So this is a complicated diagram here. So I have it broken down. This first line that I'm going to highlight here is the total wave energy striking the shoreline. And you see, as water levels are rising, so is the amount of wave energy. And we attribute that to the fact that storms that ultimately give us water levels in the Great Lakes are becoming more frequent and more intense. And the wind is right there when the storm is going by. About half of the water out of the storm falls on the lake. The other half falls on the drainage basin of Lake Michigan. And it takes that water some time, about 18 months, to finally work its way into Lake Michigan. So we have a situation where wave energy is rising very quickly, and it rises from low water times to high water times by around 15 to 25%. The waves are actually more powerful during high water than they are during low water. And the water is working its way in, but across the very bottom of this is the shoreline damage in millions of dollars. And the shoreline damage in both of these cases occurs at the peak of the wave energy, not at the peak of water. So that's why we say water levels are the enablers, and it's really the increased wave energy. So the shoreline is getting a double hit. It's getting a place, water levels are rising where the waves can do damaging work to the shoreline, and then the waves are actually larger at that point. Well, we did this analysis a long time ago, right after the high water level in 1986, so it's about 40 years old. So we did it again very recently to see if the same thing happened with the high water and the approach to high water from 2020. And these stations are all different places around Lake Michigan where there are wave measuring buoys. But again, the blue line is wave energy, wave height, and the pink line is water levels. In all these cases, the wave heights are rising before the water levels are rising. So again, we see an energy increase of 15 to 25% from low water years to high water years in the wave energy. And we are seeing more frequent storms and more powerful storms that bring stronger winds and greater waves. And eventually that water works its way into the lake and shows up as higher water levels. So the big questions are, if the wind makes waves and waves move sand, where does the sand go? How does a natural beach respond to rising lake levels and rising wave energy? How do structures on our beaches alter those natural processes? And what can we do about it? So a natural beach. So this upper diagram is a natural beach during a time when water levels are low. And you'll notice that on the part of the beach that we walk on and see, the beach is very inflated. There's a berm and there's a dune, a foredune on the beach. That's essentially sediment that has been stored there by a natural beach for when water levels begin to rise. And as water levels rise, then we move from this upper diagram to the lower diagram. And the beach gives up some of this stored sand and moves it offshore and forms sandbars. And those sandbars then serve to, when we have higher wave energy and high water, they serve to trip those waves, cause them to break. And along our shorelines, where we have typically three sandbars, they break those waves 3 times over a very wide area. So they are very dissipative to wave energy, whereas they don't allow the waves with full strength to actually hit the shoreline. And then when water levels begin to fall again after high water, we go back to this, what is called the summer beach. That is a beach that is inflated and is doing its job to store sand for that next cycle of high waters. An example from your own neighborhood here, this is Michigan City Harbor, and the fillet to the east of Michigan City Harbor, a very beautiful natural beach with 3 parallel sandbars extending out. And this is what a natural beach should look like and have the ability to constantly readjust itself to changes in water level and wave energy. Well, after the high water level in 1986, the state of Michigan was totally unprepared for the amount of damage that was done by high water then and high wave energies, and in particular, how the beach responded to that. So they asked us to set up 45 permanent survey lines. 31 of those were along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Survey line 1 starts at Michigan City, right on your border. And the 31st one here is up at Point Betsy in northern Lake Michigan. So all along Lake Michigan. And we surveyed those once they were set up. The first year was 1988, so 2 years after high water level. All the way to 2008. So for 20 years, this is how I spent my summers. It's a pretty good job, though, to be able to spend your summers on a beach. So that we surveyed these almost annually. And then again, you'll recall that 2008 is about halfway through that 14-year period of extremely low water levels, and the beaches had inflated tremendously, and I'll show you an example of that. But these are real surveys that were referenced to known benchmarks, both horizontally and vertically. Well, Shoreline Survey 6 is in Chickening Township, which is just north of New Buffalo and south of St. Joseph, Michigan. So not too far from your borderline. And again, it's just like your beach at Sheridan Beach, 3 parallel sets of sandbars. It's a natural beach with no structures anywhere on it, no armoring. And what I want to show you is how those beach profiles have changed over that 20-year period. And I know this is a lot to see, but these are all the times we've surveyed this particular area and how the 3 sandbars have moved in response to changes in water levels and wave energy. And we surveyed that again at the extreme high water level of 2020. And we added this green line, and so that you can see it more clearly, I've outlined the green line. So this is the high water line survey from top of the dune up here to a water depth of about 30 feet below the surface. And you see that the three nearshore bars are constantly moving in and out and readjusting to the new conditions. Since this was a new record-setting high water level, there was a very big offshore bar here and here, and we happened to capture that. The other point I want to make is you see all these lines for all the surveys, they all converge out at about 25 feet below the water surface. And we call that the depth of closure. And that means if sand is out this far from shoreline, and it is all sand, that's deep enough that normal fluctuations in water levels and storm waves are unable to bring it back to the shoreline. So if sand gets pushed offshore too deep, it's a natural resource that is lost deep into the lake, and it doesn't come back from any natural causes. And this is part of the process of widening the lake and filling in the deep parts of the lake. This is it's our survey line 3, which is just on the south side of New Buffalo. And this section of shoreline has been heavily armored since about the early 1990s. So this is no longer a natural beach able to constantly readjust itself. And again, you see that the profile looks quite a bit different. And if I add to that the 2020 profile, which is this green one again, here's what it looks like. And there's some important things to notice here. And that is there's a total loss of the nearshore sandbars. So waves striking these revetments and reflecting back off, and the unavailability of the beach to be able to reorganize itself has resulted in sand being pushed offshore, forming a very large single sandbar that is both larger than we've ever seen in the 34 years that we've surveyed this particular location, having more sand and being further offshore than what we've ever seen before. And there's some evidence of down cutting here out approaching this depth of closure. So again, we are driving sediment offshore where it is lost forever. And the real take-home message is the impact of revetments on the shoreline are not just the footprint of the revetment itself, but it's the damage that is done in driving sediment further offshore. And for this particular example, for every 100 feet of revetment, there's 5.7 acres of shoreline bottomland that has been impacted, which is pretty significant. So what happens with a hardened shoreline? It can be natural hardening, like where I live here in Lake Superior, we have a rocky shoreline, very steep, or it can be artificially added rock by producing large stone revetments. The process is that the waves hit the shoreline. There is no sandbars to break the waves, so they hit at very high forces. They move sand far offshore. That deepens the nearshore area, and again, letting even larger waves come in contact with the bottomlands. So I'm going to spend a little time here. This is a interesting location, service line 1, which is right at the Michigan-Indiana border. This is what that beach looked like after high water in 1986. Our first survey was in 1988. This is the survey crew, the shore part of the crew, and there's also a boat crew. But I'd like to draw your attention to two things. There are some rock boulders here pushed over the edge by the road commission. The road is right up here, which is Lakeshore Drive, the same Lakeshore Drive that continues right on down into Michigan City. This tree bush here is right on the edge of the road, and this is a stormwater drain that is suspended in midair now. was buried in dune, but all that dune eroded away. The rocks were put here to try and preserve the road here and to save that. Well, this is one site that we have visited periodically over that same 20-year period. And this is in 2008, 20 years from that first diagram. And you see this beach has inflated tremendously. It's primarily a natural beach free to do its own thing and to constantly readjust, but it has grown 20 feet vertically and it moved lakeward 250 feet during that 20-year period. And over here on the right-hand side, there is that same storm drain off the road, that same bush that we were looking at in the previous diagram. And you see it is totally buried in sand once again, as it was previous to the high water. So it's amazing how much rebuilding a natural beach is able to do. Well, if you showed up here in the late 2010 type framework and you looked at this beach, you could say to yourself, well, maybe that's a good place for a house. And for location here, this house with the white trim and the brown roof is in Indiana. This is the location of the survey. The survey team is in the same exact place for reference. And that's exactly what happened. Is the piece of property was bought by a new owner, wanted a building permit, and the state refused to allow one. A court case resulted from that, and the state of Michigan lost the appeal, and the property owner was able to gain a building permit on land that did not exist in high water of 1988. He was then sold that to a new owner, and who began building a home. And this is the home under construction in 2018. These rocks that are circled look to be the same rocks that were on the bank there. They look like they've been moved out to this area here to allow for the foundation to go. And then in 2019, as you recall, water levels started to rise. So the few rocks out in front of the house became a revetment. And then water levels peak in 2020. And this is the same house. And here is the house right here. And this is the borderline between Michigan and Indiana. So again, the shoreline had retreated at least to where it was in 1988, if not further. And this is part of that ongoing erosion that continues. Some other quick examples. Armoring the shoreline is not a permanent solution. Eventually, the armoring will fail. No matter how large and powerful it is, it will not win the war. And requires periodic maintenance. This particular section of shoreline, a little further north along the Michigan shoreline, shows at least 3 cycles of building bigger, better revetments along the shoreline. These type of revetments also have impacts on neighboring property and adjacent property, again, by directing wave energy around the ends of these types of structures. These are what we call shore parallel structures. These types of armoring are shore parallel. You can also have armoring that are shore perpendicular. This is a groin. Again, the only purpose of the groin is just to trap that river of sand for the property owner here at the expense of not providing the sand down the shoreline and interrupting that river of sand. The harbor structures are just big groins. They have the same sort of impact, and it doesn't matter whether it's a large commercial structure like St. Joseph Benton Harbor in Michigan, where the jetties are 1,800 feet or so in length, or a small New Buffalo Harbor, where it's a recreational harbor and much shorter. But you can see similarities in both of these photographs. You see a large accumulation of sediment on the updrift side on both of these, a growing beach and a natural beach to be able to adjust. And you see a lack of beach on the downdrift side of both of these, leading to intense erosion in both cases. And more importantly, you're seeing the sediment being diverted offshore by these structures. And again, if it's a large structure like Benton Harbor, St. Joseph, it is definitely going out beyond that depth of closure. So it is driving valuable nearshore resources out into deep water. Remember that second diagram that I showed you 20 minutes ago? Well, we have along the Indiana shoreline, you have two rivers of sand that are both providing up to 200,000 cubic yards per year of beautiful nearshore sand brought to you by the generous people of Michigan and Wisconsin. But there are almost total literal barriers to that sand reaching the center part of Indiana on both sides. On the west side, you have Indiana Harbor. On the east side, Burns Harbor and the structures at Michigan City. What is unique about Indiana is that most of the state is in total agreement that these are almost total barriers to sediment movement, yet there is not much being done to correct that situation. The offsets of the updrift side and the downdrift side are very pronounced in Michigan City, and there has been some sand nourishment done at Mount Baldy, as you're all aware of. And the same thing is true on the updrift shoreline at Burns Harbor and the downdrift side at Ogden Dunes. So that brings the big question of what can you do about sand being driven offshore? Softening of the shorelines is certainly something worth looking into. There's a number of things you can do to try and establish a natural beach, even if the shoreline is revetted. But again, the goal is to get the beach to be able to adjust to these changes in wave energy and water levels. There's a really good website created by the Cape Cod Coastal Resiliency folks. They showed 44 different options for the shoreline. If you click on any of those, they show you the pros and the cons and where they work and where they don't and how they cost and what maintenance fees are. It's really, really a valuable site. The other thing I'd like to mention, and this is at St. Joseph, Michigan, is beach nourishment, which is when the harbor structures are dredged and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers. That sediment is now put back on the beach, but something unique has happened in 2020, and that is the Army Corps of Engineers allowed the city to buy into the dredging program at the government reduced cost. So the city was able to purchase additional dredging for an additional 40,000 cubic yards, which went directly onto the beach. And you can see the beach is being built out and people are arriving at the beach about as quickly as it could be rebuilt. The other option is sand bypassing. And that is, rather than doing this periodically when the harbors are dredged, is to recognize that there is a loss of sand going on continuously and to establish a sand bypassing plant that continually bypasses, does nature's work that we have inhibited by having the structure there in the first place. And for a quick wrap up here, on the left-hand side is Miami Beach. Miami Beach is periodically renourished and would not exist without beach nourishment. This is its most recent renourishment project. And again, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, they do a periodic beach nourishment every 5 years and have just finished their 2022 renourishment program. And this website has a nice video explaining how they do that. So that is not real popular here in the Great Lakes, and Indiana has really, with the Park Service, has really pioneered the beach nourishment that has gone along on your shoreline and done an excellent job with it. So I wanted to rush through a lot of that stuff so that we have time for questions. So I'm going to turn that over to Dick right now, and thank you once again.
All right. Should I go ahead and start, Harshini?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, my screen. Can you see that?
Yep,
Good.
good to go.
Okay, good. So thanks, Guy, and thanks, Simon and Harshini, for having us here. Guy and I have been collaborating now for getting on close to 20 years, and I learn something new every time I watch Guy give a presentation. So I've learned some new things today. Tonight, it's really cool. Guy is a coastal geomorphologist, a coastal marine engineer. He really understands how the shoreline changes in shape and function as water levels come up and down and as storms hit. I'm a community planner and a lawyer by training, and most of my career has been on coastal shoreline management. So I think about the lakes from where I think most people think about it, which is on the shore looking out at the lakes, particularly from the beaches, and thinking about that intersection of where sand meets water. And so I've really worked on taking the good scientific knowledge that Guy brings to the table and translating it into what are the implications of this information from a community planning and regulatory and decision-making perspective. So there are a lot of challenges on figuring out how to take that good information and what should we do with it and what does it look like. So that's what I'm going to focus on for now. So a couple of points to make. This will be just a little bit repeating some of the things that Guy just presented and doing it in a way to highlight what the policy implications. I'm trying to figure out how to, there we go. I'm adjusting my own screen so I can see better what I'm looking at. Just to point out that that water, where water touches land interface is both tremendously popular by people. There's something about wanting to look out onto water. Psychologists have studied that and documented it, but it's also an incredibly biologically diverse and productive setting as well. If you have natural conditions allowed to function in those places. The really pressing concerns that we run into come about when people build on the shorelines. So one thing planners like to point out is all of the damage feet numbers that Guy was showing earlier in the presentation are both a function of the physical dynamics of what's going on the shore, but they're also very much a function of what we've built on the shore and what we're now trying to protect, how much we've invested in structures that are right next to water, and then all of the efforts we put into trying to save them from these dynamic forces. And it really boils down to two key sources of risk on the shoreline. One is inundation from overwash during storms, and the second is erosion, or the processes that Guy was just documenting. So how do we deal with those two sources of risk in nearshore settings? This is a diagram that Guy's team pulled together a couple years back for the state of Michigan that is documenting as best we can using aerial photography the movement of the shoreline landward. So legally, the process that's taking place is erosion. The term that we use to describe where the shoreline is a legal matter at any particular time, or how it's moving landward, is recession. So accretion is when the shoreline moves lakeward. Recession is when the shoreline is kind of permanently moving landward. And one of the real challenges we have in the Great Lakes is that it's not a regular process. So in many ways, the shoreline movement that's taking place is a lot like the ocean coastal states are experiencing because of sea level rise. But it's actually more of a challenge here because the way the lakes recede is, for a while, they maybe move lakeward because the lakes are low and the sand's being put back on the beach. But when the lakes come back up and those big storms hit, then they go 2 steps landward, and then they go a step lakeward, and then they go 2 steps landward. So it's a sporadic process. And I like to say people forget when the lakes go down, people forget that they're down temporarily just long enough for them to build, and then the lakes come back up. So we have kind of a long-term memory problem in how we think about the lakes. So that's a complication. Another complication that we deal with is the institutional structures that we work with on the shore and elsewhere are pretty complex, distributed across the federal, state, and local governments. In coastal settings, the federal role has primarily played itself out through infrastructure spending and cleanup efforts. So the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has put a whole lot of money into infrastructure development. The national government is the source of the National Flood Insurance Program, which tries to create incentives to communities to do good planning, but it also has a huge effect of discounting insurance, frankly, subsidizing insurance policies for people in high-risk settings, which has created some perverse incentives to build in places, perhaps, and that's something we can talk about during the question and answer period if people want to do that. That's the federal level. The other federal role is through the Coastal Zone Management Act, which is administered by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it's mainly a pass-through funding program that takes federal dollars and pushes them down through the states to provide support mainly for local governments to engage in coastal planning and zoning. And at the end of the day, in the United States, it's really the local governments that make the ultimate decisions about how to plan for nearshore development, how to regulate where things can happen and what you can do along the shore, and where we site public infrastructure facilities, particularly critical facilities like water intake and output facilities and things like that. So not only is the dynamic system that Guy just described complex and dynamic, so is the institutional policy system that we work within. That makes it challenging. Just quickly, when policy scientists try and think about what's going on here, they use really simple models. Well, you have inputs, you have these environmental conditions I just talked about, and you have the institutional arrangements. And then we have our knowledge about how those things are working. Like Guy understands the physical dynamics, I understand the institutional. How does that lead into the actions that we take, the processes we use, and what motivates decision makers? What are the outputs they produce, the documents they adopt, the plans and policies and actions? Those lead to changes in the environment, and then that feeds back into the system. It's a really simple input-output model. The reason I'm bringing it up is I want to highlight how challenging thinking about what we do about these things is. So in a coastal setting, the key thing to recognize is there's a process for making decision, and then there are attributes of this decision. And there's a pretty defined process that states and especially local governments go through when they're trying to figure out if and how and where to manage shoreline development, through planning processes, through then regulatory processes, infrastructure processes. And quite often, if you don't really understand the process and you try and get involved, you might be acting in the wrong place at the wrong time. And usually what happens is the decision that you want to affect was made 3 months ago, and that decision is already made, and there's nothing you can do about it. And now we've moved on and we have to make another decision. So if you want to get involved, and I know the Save the Dunes folks are totally aware of this and understand those processes, but you have to understand how those institutional processes work. And then you need to recognize that the people making the decisions, and here I'm talking mainly about local elected officials, city council members and township board supervisors, or at the state level, the city agency managers, they have attributes that are affecting their decision making too, like how well they know the system, both the natural and the physical systems, what they actually have the capacity to do. Do they have the analytical capacity to do analyses and understand what's going on? Do they actually have the legal capacity to make the decisions you may want them to make? And then finally, there's commitment. They might know what the problems are. They might have the capacity to do something about it. They don't have the political will to act on it. If any of those three things are missing and you're trying to promote good actions, then the actions might not happen. There's a whole lot that has to be working together and moving in the same direction. So Guy already talked about, there are a whole array of policies you can think about if you're especially interested on managing right at the shore. I think they boil down to three broad buckets. One is structural armoring hardened structures that people put in place to try and arrest those erosional processes the guy talked about. The other are nature-based solution processes or nourishing. He also talked about, and the third that nobody likes to talk about is the idea of relocation, or it's commonly called retreat. Maybe the time has come to pick a house up and move it back. The key point I want to point out here is none of these are silver bullet solutions that where it's rarely the case in a coastal setting you can have your cake and eat it too. Whenever you make a decision to do one of these things for a particular purpose, you're going to have trade-offs that you have to recognize and face. So armoring can slow erosional processes that might safeguard buildings for a time, but it's really expensive and it's ultimately going to be destroyed and degrade. And it all has all of these bad effects that Guy was just pointing out, and how it destroys the public trust beach. It moves all the sand offshore. It causes erosion on neighboring properties. Definite pros and cons there. Nourishing is promising in many ways. It's close to a natural solution, especially if you've got a good sand source that's close in, where taking it doesn't destroy the environment and putting it on the beach doesn't destroy the environment. The downside is it can be pretty short term. That beach you built up one day might be gone the next if the right storm hits. It's expensive. There are feasibility questions. Do you have a good sand supply? How would it work? And then it gets into some equity questions about who's going to pay for that sand movement and who's really benefiting from it. And so that means some really difficult community discussion about how we're kind of making those trade-offs. And then the final big bucket option is to try and preserve the natural beach, which means take the built structures that we've put there and start moving them back over. That's the best approach to conserve the ecological systems and to let the beaches function naturally. Like I was saying, that's the best beach. It's probably the most cost effective over the long term, especially when you start comparing the costs over time of continually having to rebuild armoring. The problem is that means you're losing homes and structures, or at least you're having to move them back earlier than what they would go into the lake. And people don't want to lose. That's just such a painful thing to contemplate and difficult to do. So again, all of these options have real trade-offs that we need to start contemplating. So what do we do if we want to try and start managing the beach from a local government perspective? One option is to acquire the property, particularly in riverine settings where you constantly have flooding over and over again. A really good option is to go ahead and buy that land up and turn it into a park, and then let the park become the floodplain that most of the time is dry and people can use, and every so often it becomes a big floodplain that floods, and that's fine. That's what it's designed to do. But that requires having public money and the public will to spend that money on a floodplain acquisition. It's also really helpful to start putting in low impact infrastructure and try and keep water on site and think carefully about how water is moving. It's really unfortunate that a lot of shoreline property owners who have homes up on bluffs put their septic systems on the lakeward side of their buildings, and what they're doing is setting up to increase the bluff failure rate, have that bluff fail much sooner than it would otherwise, because you're putting water unnaturally into the system. So you got to really think carefully about designing landscapes to manage water in a prudent way. And then the other big option is to start regulating development, start building setbacks and having people move back from them. This is imagery from St. Joseph, Michigan. You can kind of see it right there as a house that got built that everybody else realized that's a really bad thing to have happened. That created the political will for the city to do a study, an engineering study, and kind of document sand movement, and that gave them the will to adopt that setback. And a few images back, I'll go back real quick. That house is the same house, and that's the house that's being picked up and moved, because when the lakes came back up after this picture was taken, the water was lapping on the front of the building, and the city told them, we're not going to give you a permit. We didn't want you to build out there in the first place. We have a setback now. So they had to pick up that house and move it back. Unfortunately, they couldn't move it back as far as they probably should have, because they already had another house sitting behind it. So that's a good case study of the difficulties we get into when we build in those high-risk settings. Let me talk just quickly about some legal doctrines. So I'm going to focus here on Michigan, because that's the state I've studied the most. All of the Great Lake states, all 8 of them, have what's called the public trust doctrine. It's a constitutional common law statutory doctrine where the state recognizes an ownership and duty interest to protect public trust natural resources at the shoreline. One of the key features of this doctrine is that the submerged bottomlands of the lakes are owned by the state. So if you're on an inland lake and on the states and you're a riparian owner, you own to the bottom of the lake. But if you're a shorefront owner on the Great Lakes, if you're a littoral owner, you don't own to the bottom of the lake. You only own somewhere in here, and then the state takes ownership of the submerged bottomlands. And because of these natural dynamics, the border distinguishing between the state's owned submerged bottomlands and the privately owned uplands is called a movable freehold. That boundary moves back and forth to north, back and forth naturally as the lake levels come up and down and the shoreline does its thing. So that means if you're on a stretch of shoreline that's naturally receding a foot per year, you own technically, legally, naturally diminishing property. It's only a matter of time before it will dissolve, if you will, into the lake, which is not something anybody who owns property on the shore wants to hear. There's some questions now about how that plays out legally through litigation, and we haven't seen those questions answered yet. I'll talk about that in a minute because there hasn't been the right litigation. But there are stretches on Lake Michigan and in Michigan where the shoreline's actually pretty stable, but in a lot of places it's actually receding, and that's where we're getting these conflicts. The other piece of the doctrine is that when the lakes are low enough for a dry sandy beach to show up, there's a public trust right to walk along the sandy beach in Michigan. So there's an overlapping set of interests. So here's Michigan. When you are a private shoreland owner, you owned all the way down to the swash, to where the water is touching the beach. But there's a public trust interest up to the ordinary high water mark, and that's the stretch where the public has the right to walk along the beach. That is owned by the state. Out here, it's owned in fee. Here, it's owned, there's an public trust interest impressed on that private ownership. Ohio is the one state that's the most conservative and protective of private property owners. If you're in Ohio and you want to be on public trust submerged bottomland, you have to be out in the water. Your ankles have to be wet. Indiana now is the most protective of its public beaches because of the Gunderson decision, which came down a few years back, which held that there is actually state fee ownership of the submerged bottomlands all the way up to the ordinary high water mark, and then private ownership after that part. The really big debate legally in all of these places is, how do you mark ordinary high water? What's the right way to think about that, and how do you know exactly where that is? And I won't get into that right now, but if people have questions on that later, I can talk about that too. So we did a long study. We tried to think through all of the possible legal claims that could be brought in Michigan because of these conflicts at the shore. And just to quickly step through this, what we decided was it's the state that enjoys the public trust doctrine. The local governments don't enjoy it. But if someone brings a lawsuit against the state saying, you can't do this, the courts are almost certainly going to say, yes, you can. The states have this public trust responsibility and duty and interest. What we see in Michigan is, even though the state constitutional and statutory authorities appear to prefer natural beaches, the administrative rules that are in place seem to prefer allowing private property owners to put up structures to protect their homes. So there's a conflict of laws there that I don't think has been sorted out in the state yet. Local governments do not enjoy the public trust doctrine authorities, but localities in Michigan have really broad public health, police power, protection powers that basically let them do the same thing. They've got a lot of authority to adopt regulations to protect the natural environment. And I haven't looked specifically at Michigan, but I suspect that that's also true in the state of Indiana as well. Everybody quickly goes to the constitutional claims. If you regulate my property and you tell me I can't put in a seawall or something, I'm going to sue you for violating my due process rights, or I'm going to sue you for a regulatory taking. Your regulation has effectively taken my property. Our analysis in Michigan was that we don't think, we think the state has a lot of authority to protect natural beaches. We think they would likely prevail on any due process or equal protection claims, especially if the regulations are well designed and administered. We think there are good reasons to think that a local government of the state protecting natural beaches and basically telling people you have to pick your house up and move it back now. We're not going to let you armor would probably survive regulatory takings claims too. But we don't know because those precise questions haven't been litigated in the courts yet. The really big challenge is there's a lot of places where existing armoring already is in place. And that raises a whole lot of equity concerns about, well, wait a minute, you let them build a seawall. Why aren't you letting me? Or wait a minute, I've had this seawall here forever. Now you're telling me I can't repair it. You're going to make me take it out. That's a kind of fairness over time question that we'll have to sort out through the courts. So just to kind of start to wrap things together, there are a lot of local officials who are pretty resistant to the idea of proactive coastal management, particularly when that maybe involves telling shoreline property owners they can't do everything they want to do. And we've tried to figure out what's going on or what are the motivations that are preventing that. And here's just a list that we often hear that, yeah, these coastal issues are pressing, but they only come up once every 10 years and they're just not pressing enough for us to worry about except when they happen. And the rest of the time we're just too busy, or they don't really understand or believe the hazards, or maybe they understand them, but they don't really think they're going to likely occur here, or they're worried that most of their tax base is on the shorefront and we don't want to put that at risk, or that we're benefiting from that development. And we, if the storm's bad enough, the federal government's going to kick in and help us out. We're not really bearing the risk, or we just can't get over the idea that we're going to protect private property rights, period. And if that means destroying the natural beach, that's the decision. That's where we're going to land. Or maybe it should be the state that's taking responsibility for this, or we just don't have the capacity. Or what I often hear most is it's just too late. The shoreline's already developed. We have to protect it. All compelling reasons from a local government official perspective. So what do we need to do as we're kind of looking forward, given all the development that's happened and given that the natural conditions are only going to get worse? It's not enough to know the problems. You have to know the policy decision-making system too, if you want to have an effect. Don't think that just because we're telling you how natural systems work, that decision makers, wisdom will dawn upon decision makers and they'll make decisions that you think they should make. The science that Guy's presenting might tell us where the problem is, but doesn't answer what do we do about it and who should act and how should they act and what should they do. Now we're getting into these normative policy questions and legal questions about who's responsible for what. Recognize that decision makers use heuristics. We're humans. They're human. We're all human. We engage our belief systems. We make short rules of thumb decisions about what's going on. Sometimes the facts just aren't persuasive because there are other concerns going on here. And so it's also their capacity to act and their commitment to act that drive decision making. So work to improve both the decisions and the processes that are at play here. Where do we go from here? I think we need to start having really hard conversations about the trade-offs we're facing, given where people want to live in these highly dynamic places, recognizing that Mother Nature is a hugely powerful force and there's only so much you can do. Having said that, we probably need to start thinking about triage. It's hard to think about picking up the city of Chicago and moving it back from the shoreline or really developed urban centers, but there are lots of stretches of shoreline that have maybe partially developed where maybe that's more feasible. We need to start tempering expectations about how much we can expect to battle Mother Nature and prevail. And we just need to kind of continually be evaluating these processes and iterating the process over and over again. This presentation has been made available or will be made available to you by the Save the Dunes folks. And at the tail end are a whole bunch of papers. If you really want to get into the nitty gritty of all of this, I've listed them here for your access. And then that wraps up my presentation and I will stop sharing.
Awesome.
That was a whirlwind. Guy and I gave you like a whirlwind tour through the physical and legal processes driving decision-making on the shore.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. So I'm just going to quickly go over our section really quick. And then at the end, we're going to stop for some questions. So let me just share screen real quick and let's get started. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as you can tell with both of our experts, this is something that we've been thinking about a lot. And so I'm just going to bring it back to Northwest Indiana and talk about how you can help if you are in our 3 counties of Northwest Indiana, specifically Lake, Porter, or LaPorte County. So ways that you can help, first and foremost, exactly what Dick just said, become a local advocate. Really think about what you can do, if you can talk to your local leaders about what's going on, if you can become more resilient, especially in your own community, in your own neighborhood, thinking about these things, researching your own local town ordinances. That's a huge one. All of the different towns have different ordinances. They're all a little bit different. Learning about your community's impacts to shoreline erosion, particularly, of course, on the Lake Michigan shoreline in Indiana. And then, of course, considering nature-based solutions. So shoreline communities can work with government agencies such as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, looking at nature-based solutions and erosion issues rather than these short-term human-made structures. They may be more harmful to the environment. Of course, we always ask that you do really ask those experts at the U.S. Army Corps, listen to them, and they'll be able to help you with those solutions as well. And then last and foremost, of course, educating yourself and then also educating others in your community. So once you learn what works in your area, making sure that everyone in your community is also educated and has the same information. Learning about your impacts to shoreline erosion as an individual in Northwest Indiana, and then doing things like avoiding going on social trails. The social trails in our area erode our dunes and harm our critical plants and habitat needed to make our Indiana shoreline more resilient. So on the picture to the right here, you can see some marram grass on top of our dunes. So those really are necessary to help keep those dunes in place and not erode them. So really following the trail markers, especially in the national and state park in the Indiana dunes, really following them, not creating your own social trails is highly, highly important. Okay, and so I just want to mention that we do have all of these different coastal resiliency topics on our fact sheet. So we are created these coastal resiliency fact sheets, which will be available on our Save the Dunes website at the end of the year. So all of this information will be in a very easily digitally accessible way on our Save the Dunes website. We'll be sharing it online as well. So please do take a look at them. We do have a fact sheet for a lot of different general coastal resiliency topics. So some of them are listed here are wetlands, shoreline erosion. We do a general coastal resiliency thing that goes overall, an arching overall introduction into what coastal resiliency is, especially in our region of Northwest Indiana, protecting biodiversity, recreating responsibly, and living in the dunes. So we'll let you guys know through social media when those are going to be live and on our Save the Dunes website. So just stay tuned for that. And as Em said in the beginning, all of these webinars are recorded on our Save the Dunes YouTube website. So all of these 4 listed here, including the one today, Shoreline Erosion, will be recorded on our Save the Dunes website. So please feel free to share them. We do try and do a lot of these webinars to educate the Northwest Indiana general public. So thank you so much for joining us. And Em, I'll pass it on to you.
All right, thanks, Guy and Richard and Harshini. These are just our touch points for social media and our newsletter. I did drop the link in the chat to sign up for our newsletter. So if anyone is here tonight and wants to sign up for that, that's in the chat. And then we're really active on Facebook and Instagram. So if you're wondering what's going on in the dunes, how you can get involved, what we're working on, definitely follow us along on either of those platforms. And like Harshini mentioned about our YouTube page, this presentation, all of our previous presentations in this series, and a lot of other webinars and things we put on, because we just feel that they're more accessible on a webinar scenario and recorded for people to share the information, because the more you know and the more you share with your networks, the better we can protect our Indiana dunes. There were a couple of questions that I'd love to get to for you guys. So John Allen, who is a Save the Dunes member, is here with us. He asked, are water levels trending higher over the long term? So I think this is also like one of my questions, like what else affects lake levels? I'm kind of curious as to go into that a little bit. Oh, you're muted, Guy. You're talking.
Thank you. I was saying that's a great question. The controller of lake levels is the atmosphere above the lakes. Approximately 10 times more water flows above the Great Lakes than flows out the St. Lawrence Seaway. So the balance between precipitation and evaporation, which is water coming into the lakes or water coming out of the lakes, is the real controller. There's some control on Lake Ontario, and there's a small bit of control on Lake Superior. The Chicago River on Lake Michigan is really negligible. Um, so these fluctuations that we see in water levels are really the result of the balance between whether we spend more time in a drier atmosphere or more time in a wetter atmosphere. Um, the long-term guess on where this is all going is the jury is still out on that. There's been a number of long-range forecasts. Some say slightly up, some say slightly down in the long term, and the long term is greater than 50 years. But the one point that everyone seems to um, agree on is that the extremes are going to get greater. So we're going to see higher high levels of water and lower low levels. And the fact that we went from a record-setting low in 2013 to a new record-setting high in 2020 kind of
I just
lends.
shared my screen, guys, so you can talk about it.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah. So, we essentially went here from right here in 2099 to a long-term record low in 2013, and then to a record high 7 years later. So we're going to keep seeing bigger and bigger lows and bigger highs.
Yeah, now, can I jump in, Guy, and point out, Drew
Sure.
Groenwald is a climate scientist here at U of M who's done a lot of work on this, and he pointed out to me, I hadn't really noticed it until he pointed it out. This is Lake Ontario. That's the natural variation that was going on until they put in the Moses Saunders Dam. Is that right?
Yep.
And at that point, now they're moderating water flows on Lake Ontario, and they even, for the amount of moderation that's taking place, they still can't control the extremes. So even with all of that control, they still hit major highs in 2020 that flooded a lot of shoreline properties in New York State. And so we would often hear when Guy and I would present, the problem is they're not controlling the water inflow into the lake and the water outflow in the lake, and it's not the management system. And what Drew and scientists keep telling me is no, the ability of us to control the natural system is really small. It's the natural system that we have to deal with, and we have to recognize that and don't think that we can engineer our way out of it. And the rule of thumb I'm using now with in policymaking settings is we should expect the highs are going to be higher and the lows are going to be lower, and the frequency between those periods are probably going to increase. We'll see them kind of coming sooner. So everybody's worried about the high water levels now, but it's just a matter of time before people can't get their boats back out into the lake again, and then we'll be talking about low water.
Yeah. Thank you, Dick. That was excellent. And one thing to keep in mind is Lake Superior holds 53% of all the water in the Great Lakes. Or another way of saying that is there's more water in Lake Superior than the other four lakes combined.
Yeah.
So, we peaked in water level in 2019, and a year later, that all flowed downhill to Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and then you can see it on those charts working its way out through the whole system. So keep an eye on Lake Superior. Right now, we're we're down quite low. So I think, right now, the next couple of years, we're gonna continue to see lower lake levels, and that is the short-term projections.
Okay. Another question we had from David is, are revetments being made illegal in Michigan and Indiana?
In Michigan, the state was as ready for the 2020 high as they were in 1986. And they resorted in Michigan to do whatever you think you need to do to your property, and we'll sort it out after the fact. So that resulted in a tremendous increase in the hardened structures along the shoreline, and the entire area from New Buffalo to the Indiana border is almost totally armored now, with maybe an occasional pocket beach that is being destroyed by the armoring on either side of it. So the state is partly because of the research that they funded and we did, and the stuff that Dick has been working on with the state as well, are now in the process of taking another look at their policies. And they're starting to realize that the impacts of armoring are much greater than they had accounted for in the past. So not sure where it'll go, but that's the trend right now.
Yeah, not sure. I've not heard of any specific proposals to make them illegal. I can tell you though, one of his images was Chickaming Township, which is not far from where you all are. That's the one township I know of in Michigan that the township has banned the installation of hard shoreline armoring, which they can do through their local police power authorities. And they decided, we're a beach community. Who's going to want to come to the beach if there's no beach left? And we recognize that may mean that people are going to have to pick up homes and move them back at some point, but that will save the beach. So they've made the decision to save the beach instead of particular beach houses. Now, we haven't seen how resilient that ordinance is going to be when the lakes come back up again, and the reality of that plays itself out. So there's always that too. But I've not heard any particular proposals at the state level to ban them. Because of work that Guy and I did, there was one stretch of beach where they actually denied a permit to install a seawall because it became clear it wasn't going to help and it was only going to do damage, and they had a good justification for not allowing it. But so far, those have been the exceptions, not the rule.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. Lots to think about, especially for us as an advocacy organization. Okay, one more question from Faye. She said, can either of you speak to whether and how the absence of the winter ice shelves are impacting coastal erosion?
So just before either of you have it, I actually didn't put this on the screen because we kind of ran out of time, but we did have a slide on this. So while you both are answering this, I'm just gonna share this.
Great. So
Guy, that's you. Answer that question.
So, okay, I would just say from the Northwest Indiana perspective, we didn't have enough time, but now since somebody asked about it. So, we do think about this. So, one of our amazing people from our Indiana coastal program, so shout out to Joe, when we talked to him about the shoreline erosion, this is one of the things that we definitely have noticed. So, of course, shelf ice does protect our shoreline, especially in Indiana, from our winter storms. And so these warmer temperatures that we've been getting over the last couple of years leads to less shelf ice. And then, of course, that forms over Lake Michigan in the winters, which now will increase the erosion, especially in Indiana on our Lake Michigan shoreline. But Dick, Guy, if you would like to talk about your experiences as well with shelf ice, and I would love to.
Guy, to explain that process, and then maybe I'll talk about it from a legal perspective.
Yeah. So in that most recent 42-year analysis we did on wave energy and water levels, we also accounted for ice cover throughout all of Lake Michigan. And what we have found, in particularly exactly what you're saying, and that is in northern Lake Michigan, where ice was a major contributor, the wave energy has increased substantially with the lack of ice over the last 10 years. So absolutely true.
So physically, so then the following that I want to point out again is, I know I'm a little bit worried that people are talking about using nature-based solutions as if that's going to be the silver bullet that saves you on a natural beach. And it's probably true that that's going to be effective on an inland lake that's got a low fetch and doesn't have all the wave dynamics that Guy's talking about. You can have lots of vegetation and maybe coil logs and things like that that'll work. But the more you get out onto open lakefront, where the high energy waves are, nature-based solutions, to really make them effective, they become revetments with vegetation on top of them, and they're really still at that. They're just at that point of revetment. So it's use the right system for the right kind of physical setting, and recognize that nature-based solution, the best nature-based solution is to let the natural beach be a natural beach. That's the nature-based solution. You can't really engineer a nature-based solution on those settings. Just the energy is just too high. This is me pretending to be a coastal geomorphologist like Guy, because I've learned so much from him. But tell me if I'm wrong, Guy. I think I just want folks to think there's a solution out there. We just have to build the nature-based solution and we'll be good. Maybe not.
Excellent point.
Okay, well, that's all the questions that we had in the chat here. Happy to answer any other questions, but thank you both so much for joining us tonight.